The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine brown powder that coated the tongue and clung to the silk of Lynn's brilliant red Cheong Sam. It was a color of celebration, of joy and new beginnings, but here, under the bleached-out canvas of the western sky, it felt like a wound. She stood alone beside her single wooden trunk, a splash of impossible crimson against the monochrome palette of the town. The stagecoach that had carried her for the final, bone-jarring leg of her journey was already a shrinking silhouette on the horizon, taking with it the last familiar scent of the world she knew. She clutched the letter in her hand. The paper softened and creased from 1,000 readings. It was a promise, signed by a man named Franklin Reed, a man who had written of a new life, a partnership, a future built on the raw, promising soil of America. Her heart, a frantic bird in her chest, beat a rhythm of hope against the cage of her ribs. Then she saw him. He was handsomer than his photograph, with a confident smile and eyes the color of a summer sky. He strode towards her from the saloon, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment her hope solidified into certainty. This was him. This was her future. He stopped a few feet from her, his smile faltering as his gaze swept over her, from the intricate coils of her dark hair to the delicate embroidery of phoenixes on her dress. The appreciation in his eyes curdled into something else, something sharp and assessing. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered, the blacksmith wiping his hands on his apron, the women peering from the shaded porch of the general store. "You're Lynn?" Franklin Reed's voice was not unkind, but it was laced with a confusion that felt like a slap. She nodded, offering a small, rehearsed bow. "I am Lynn. It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Reed." He laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. He looked over his shoulder at his friends lounging by the saloon doors, then back at her. "There's been a mistake," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words hung in the thick, hot air. A mistake? Her mind raced, trying to find purchase. Had she come on the wrong day? Was this not Redemption Creek? He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more humiliating than a shout. "The photograph. It didn't do you justice. Not at all." He shook his head, a look of profound inconvenience on his handsome face. I was expecting someone plain, sturdy, someone who looks like they can handle the work." He gestured vaguely towards the unforgiving landscape. "You," he said, his eyes raking over her again. "You look like a porcelain doll. You're too pretty. It'll cause trouble." A wave of heat, entirely separate from the sun, washed over her face. Trouble? Her beauty, something her mother had always called a gift, was being presented as a defect, a liability. The townspeople were silent now, their curiosity hardening into a morbid fascination. They were watching a dream die on Main Street. "I am very strong," she managed to say, her voice a thin thread of sound. "I can work hard, I promise." Franklin Reed sighed, a performance of deep regret. "I'm sure you can, but that's not the point. A wife out here needs to blend in, not stand out. This won't work." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, pressing them into her palm. "This should be enough for a meal. The next stage east comes through in 2 days. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." And with that, he turned his back on her, dismissing her as easily as one would shoo away a stray dog. He walked back to his friends, who clapped him on the shoulder, their laughter carrying on the hot, dry air. Lynn stood frozen, the heavy coins cold against her skin. The red dress, once a symbol of her bright future, now felt like a costume for a fool. She was a spectacle of rejection, a crimson stain on the dusty earth, utterly and completely alone. The silence that followed Franklin Reed's departure was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The stares of the townspeople were no longer just curious. They were pitying, speculative, and in some, a flicker of cruel satisfaction. Lynn felt their eyes on her like physical blows, each one a fresh sting of shame. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to fold herself into the small trunk that held all her worldly possessions. But there was nowhere to go. The stagecoach was gone. The man who had promised her a home had cast her aside for the crime of being beautiful. Her mind, numb with shock, began to replay the long journey. The weeks on the rocking, groaning ship, the constant sickness, the fear that mingled with a desperate, burning hope. She had studied the English phrases in her small book until her eyes ached, practiced her signature, and memorized the details of Franklin's letters. He had written of wide-open spaces, of building a life from nothing, of needing a partner to share in the hardship and the triumph. He had never mentioned needing her to be plain. She thought of her village, of the quiet pride in her parents' eyes as they sent their only daughter to a land of opportunity. They had sold their most prized possessions to afford her passage and a dowry. They had believed in the promise as much as she had. Now that promise was dust in her mouth. The heat of the sun beat down on her head, and the world began to feel unsteady, the wooden storefronts wavering at the edges of her vision. She was a foreigner in a foreign land, with a handful of coins that felt more like an insult than a help. Her vibrant cheongsam, meant for a joyful meeting, now marked her as an outsider, an exotic creature to be gawked at. A woman in a faded calico dress, the proprietor of the general store, watched her with arms crossed, her face a mask of stern appraisal. A few cowboys who had witnessed the exchange whispered to each other, their smirks cutting deeper than any outright insult. They saw a discarded object, not a person. Franklin Reed had not just rejected her. He had stripped her of her dignity in front of an entire town, turning her hope into a public spectacle. He had made her into a story they would tell for weeks, the pretty little mail-order bride who wasn't wanted. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she instinctively reached out, her hand finding the rough wood of her trunk to steady herself. She was 18 years old. She had crossed an ocean, and she had never, in her entire life, felt so profoundly lost. The town of Redemption Creek, which had sounded so full of hope in the letters, now felt like a prison with no walls. Every direction she looked, she saw only endless, unforgiving land and the hard, unyielding faces of strangers. The future, once a bright and shining path, had vanished, leaving her standing at a cliff's edge with nowhere to step. From the cool shadows of the livery stable, Nathaniel Blackwood had watched the entire sordid affair. He had seen the hope in the young woman's posture as she waited, a fragile flame in the harsh sunlight. He had seen the casual cruelty in Franklin Reed's dismissal, a performance for the town's gossips. Nathaniel was not a man for public displays. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling territory that kept him isolated by choice and by necessity. He came to town only when required. His presence often met with a mixture of respect for his wealth and suspicion for his solitude. He despised men like Reed, men who treated life as a game and people as pawns. He saw the woman, Lynn, Reed had called her, begin to sway, her face pale beneath the merciless sun. He saw the vultures circling, the whispers and the leering glances. Something in him, a quiet, protective instinct he rarely indulged, stirred to life. He pushed himself off the wall he'd been leaning against and walked out into the oppressive glare of the street. His steps were measured and silent, his tall frame casting a long shadow that fell over Lynn just as her knees began to buckle. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide with a fear that he might be another tormentor. He stopped before her, his expression unreadable. He was not a handsome man in the way Franklin Reed was. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines of grim determination. But his eyes, a deep and steady gray, held no mockery. He took in the fine silk of her dress, the exhaustion etched onto her features, and the profound despair in her gaze. He ignored the gasps and murmurs from the onlookers as he addressed her, his voice a low rumble that cut through the thick air. "He is a fool," Nathaniel said, the words simple and direct. It was not a compliment, but a statement of fact. He looked at her trunk, then back at her. "You cannot stay here in the street. The sun is unforgiving." He wasn't offering comfort or pity, but a practical solution to an immediate problem. This Lynn could understand. She straightened her back, a flicker of her inner strength returning. "I do not have anywhere to go," she said, her English precise but quiet. "The next stage is not for 2 days." "I am aware," Nathaniel replied. He gave a curt nod. "I have a ranch. There is a spare room. It is clean and safe. You can stay there until you decide what is to be done." The offer was so unexpected, so starkly different from the humiliation she had just endured, that she could only stare at him. The townspeople were now openly gawking. Nathaniel Blackwood, the reclusive rancher who barely spoke a dozen words on his trips to town, was offering shelter to the rejected Chinese bride. It was a scandal and a miracle all at once. Martha, the store owner, watched with a narrowed, calculating gaze, her judgment momentarily suspended. "Why?" Lynn asked, the word barely a whisper. She had to understand. Nathaniel's gray eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something beyond his stoic exterior, a flicker of an old sorrow, a deep-seated hatred of injustice. "Because no one deserves to be left in the dust," he said simply. He didn't wait for a more formal acceptance. He bent down, lifted her heavy trunk with an ease that spoke of immense strength, and gestured with his head towards a sturdy wagon parked nearby. "Come, my foreman is waiting." Without another word, he turned and began walking. For a moment, Lynn remained rooted to the spot, the town's collective gaze still upon her. Then she made a choice. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and followed the tall, silent stranger, leaving the whispers and the shame of Redemption Creek behind her. Her future was no longer a shining path, but a single set of footprints in the dust, leading into the unknown. The news of Nathaniel Blackwood's intervention spread through Redemption Creek faster than a prairie fire. By nightfall, Franklin Reed was no longer the man who had wisely avoided a bad match, but the man who had been implicitly condemned by the valley's most powerful rancher. His pride, already inflated by his public performance, was now deeply wounded. He sat in the saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey as his friends tried to placate him. "Don't you worry about Blackwood," one of them slurred. "He's a strange one. Probably just felt sorry for the girl." But Franklin knew it was more than that. Blackwood's quiet act of defiance was a judgment. It made Franklin look cruel and small, and he couldn't stand it. His charisma was his currency in this town, and Blackwood had devalued it with a single, simple action. The next morning he began his campaign to reclaim his narrative. He started at the general store, leaning against the counter as Martha tallied up his purchases. "It's a shame about that business yesterday," he began, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "I truly am. But the girl, she wasn't what was advertised in the letters. She was deceptive." Martha paused, her pencil hovering over the ledger. "Deceptive how, Franklin? She looked exactly like the photograph you showed me, only prettier." Franklin waved a dismissive hand. "That's just it. It's a trick. They send these pretty delicate ones who look like they can't lift a feather. They get here, and they're useless for a frontier wife. They expect to be waited on. I saved myself a lifetime of trouble." He began to embellish the story, painting himself as the victim of a bait-and-switch scheme. He told the blacksmith she had demanded money the moment she arrived. He told the men at the saloon that she had looked at the town with disdain, as if it were beneath her. He twisted his shallow reasoning. she's too pretty, into a prudent, justifiable act of self-preservation. And now she's up at the Blackwood place, he'd say, shaking his head with mock concern. You know how he is. A man like that, alone with a woman like her, it's not right. It's not decent. She'll be trouble for him, you mark my words. He was planting seeds of suspicion, playing on the town's inherent prejudice and their wariness of the reclusive rancher. He needed to poison the well, to turn Lynn from a victim into a problem, a seductress, a foreign complication in their simple lives. His humiliation festered, turning into a possessive sort of rage. She was supposed to be his to accept and his to reject. Blackwood's interference had stolen his power, his control over the story. He couldn't let it stand. His resentment began to focus on Nathaniel, but its sharpest point was aimed at Lynn. He had cast her off, yet she had landed somewhere safe. It felt like a personal affront. That afternoon he rode his horse out on the trail that led towards the Blackwood ranch, stopping at the edge of the property line. He stared at the distant homestead, a fortress of solitude in the vast expanse. She was in there. The porcelain doll he had rejected was now under the protection of the one man in the valley he couldn't intimidate. The injustice of it burned in his gut. He had made her into nothing, and Nathaniel Blackwood was threatening to make her into something. He wouldn't allow it. The Blackwood ranch was an island of order in a sea of wild, untamed land. The main house was built of dark, sturdy timber and river stone, solid and unpretentious. A weathered porch wrapped around it, offering shade from the relentless sun. Compared to the ramshackle buildings of Redemption Creek, it felt like a palace. Nathaniel led Lynn to a small, clean room at the back of the house. It contained a simple bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out onto a vast, rolling pasture. It was more than she could have hoped for. You will be safe here, he said, setting her trunk down. My foreman, Samuel, and his wife live in the small cottage by the barn. You will not be alone. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Rest. We will speak tomorrow. Then he was gone, leaving Lynn in a silence that felt blessedly different from the one in town. This was a silence of peace, not judgment. For the first few days she barely saw him. She kept to her room, venturing out only when she was sure he was gone, to the kitchen where Samuel's wife, a quiet woman named Clara, would leave a plate of food for her. Slowly, cautiously, Lynn began to explore her sanctuary. She found a small, neglected patch of earth near the house, where a few hardy herbs struggled to survive. With tentative care, she began to tend to it, her fingers finding comfort in the solid feel of the soil. It was a small act of creation in the wake of her life's destruction. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Nathaniel found her there, kneeling by the small garden. She had been so absorbed in her work she hadn't heard him approach. She looked up, startled, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He said nothing for a long moment, his gray eyes taking in the careful way she had weeded and watered the thirsty plants. My mother planted that garden, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She said a home needs roots, same as people. Lynn looked down at the small green shoots. They are very resilient, she whispered. They want to live. Nathaniel looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the rejected bride in the scandalous red dress, but a young woman of quiet, formidable strength. He saw the same resilience she admired in the plants. A few days later, a wagon rattled up the path. It was Martha from the general store, her face set in its usual stern lines. She was there to deliver supplies, but her true purpose was clearly investigation. She found Lynn on the porch, mending one of Nathaniel's shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. "Heard you landed on your feet," Martha said, skipping any pleasantries. She handed Lynn a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Brought you something. Every woman needs a proper sunbonnet in this country. That fancy hair of yours will fry otherwise. Lynn took the gift, surprised. Thank you. Martha grunted, her eyes sharp and assessing. Nathaniel Blackwood is a good man, a quiet man. He carries burdens you wouldn't understand. Don't you go causing him any trouble. It was a warning, but it lacked the malice of Franklin's gossip. It was the cautious advice of someone who, in their own way, cared. I would not, Lynn replied earnestly. He has shown me great kindness. Martha seemed to find the answer acceptable. She gave a curt nod. See that you don't forget it. As she left, Nathaniel came out onto the porch. He and Martha exchanged a look of long, silent understanding. He watched her wagon disappear, then turned his gaze to Lynn, who was holding the simple, practical sunbonnet as if it were a precious jewel. It was the first gift she had received in this new land, a symbol of belonging, however tenuous. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Nathaniel's lips. The roots, he thought, were beginning to take hold. Franklin Reed's campaign of whispers and lies began to bear bitter fruit. In a town as small as Redemption Creek, gossip was a powerful currency, and he was spending it lavishly. He painted a picture of Lynn as a cunning opportunist, and Nathaniel as a fool being manipulated by a beautiful foreigner. He played on the deepest fears of the community, the fear of the unknown, the suspicion of outsiders, and the simmering resentment towards a man as wealthy and aloof as Nathaniel Blackwood. Franklin's next move was to give his slander the weight of law. He went to see Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made more of political ambition than of moral conviction. "Sheriff," Franklin began, his voice laced with civic concern, "I'm worried about the situation up at the Blackwood Ranch. We have a foreign woman, with no papers to speak of, living with an unmarried man. It's an affront to the decency of this town." The sheriff, who preferred a quiet life, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now, Franklin, what Nathaniel does on his own property is his business." "Is it?" Franklin pressed, leaning forward. "She has no sponsor. I rejected her, which was my right. By law, she should have been sent back on the next stage. Instead, Blackwood is harboring her. For all we know, she's a vagrant, or worse. It sets a bad precedent." He knew which buttons to push. The words vagrant and foreigner were potent. They implied a threat to the town's fragile order. The sheriff sighed, knowing he couldn't ignore a formal complaint, especially from a man with Reed's influence. "All right, Franklin. I'll ride out there. I'll look into it." The next afternoon, Sheriff Miller arrived at the Blackwood Ranch, his tin star glinting in the sun. Nathaniel met him on the porch, his face like granite. Lynn watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding. "Nathaniel," the sheriff started, avoiding his eyes, "I'm here on official business. There's been a complaint filed about your guest." "A complaint," Nathaniel stated, his voice flat and cold. "Filed by Franklin Reed, I imagine." "He's concerned she doesn't have a legal right to be here, that she has no means of support," the sheriff mumbled, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. At that moment, Lynn stepped out of the house. She had changed from her cheongsam into a simple dress of borrowed calico. She stood beside Nathaniel, her posture straight, her expression composed, though fear swam in her eyes. Nathaniel didn't even look at her, but she felt the protective solidity of his presence beside her. He addressed the sheriff, but his words were a clear message to the whole town. "Miss Lynn is not a guest," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing with authority. "She is an employee. I have hired her as a housekeeper for the ranch. She earns a fair wage and is under my protection. You can inform Mr. Reed that his concern is entirely misplaced." The sheriff was taken aback. This was a clean, legal arrangement he couldn't dispute. An employer-employee relationship, while unusual in these circumstances, was perfectly legitimate. He had no grounds to interfere. "A housekeeper," the sheriff repeated, relieved to have a simple answer to take back to town. "Right. Well, that settles that, then." He tipped his hat awkwardly. "Sorry to have troubled you, Nathaniel. Ma'am." He turned and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and an unresolved tension in his wake. Lynn looked up at Nathaniel, her gratitude a tangible thing in the air between them. He had not only sheltered her, he had given her a legitimate place in this world, a shield against the poison Franklin Reed was spreading. But they both knew this was only a temporary solution. Franklin's malice was not so easily thwarted. He had forced Nathaniel's hand, pushing their private arrangement into the public sphere and raising the stakes for everyone involved. The quiet sanctuary of the ranch suddenly felt much more vulnerable. The confrontation Franklin Reed had been engineering finally came to a head on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. Nathaniel needed supplies, and for the first time he asked Lynn to accompany him to town. It was a calculated move, a quiet declaration that she was not someone to be hidden away in shame. As they walked down Main Street towards the general store, a hush fell over the town. People stopped to stare. Lynn, wearing her new sunbonnet and the simple calico dress, walked with a quiet dignity, her eyes fixed forward, but she could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Franklin Reed, who had been drinking in the saloon with his cronies, saw them through the swinging doors. It was a public challenge he could not ignore. He swaggered out into the street, blocking their path. His face was flushed with whiskey and rage. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, his eyes locking on to Lynn. "The housekeeper. Taking a stroll with your employer, are you? Or is it more than that?" Nathaniel placed a steadying hand on Lynn's arm, his body language a clear warning. "Step aside, Reed." But Franklin was too far gone in his arrogance to heed it. He lunged forward, grabbing Lynn's other arm. His grip was brutal. "Tell me, did you learn housekeeping on the boat ride over? Is that what they're calling it these days?" he hissed, his face close to hers. "See, I told you all she was trouble. A pretty little doll with nothing inside but schemes." The townspeople watched, frozen in a mixture of horror and fascination. This was the ugly climax they had all been waiting for. Nathaniel's face was a thundercloud, his fists clenched. But before he could act, something shifted in Lynn. She did not cry out or struggle. Instead, she stood perfectly still and looked directly into Franklin Reed's eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear fire. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the charged silence with the clarity of a bell. She said a single, sharp phrase in her native tongue, the words unfamiliar, but their intent unmistakable. Then she translated, her English slow and deliberate for all to hear. "A person's worth is not in their face," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It is in their heart. Yours is empty." The simplicity and power of the rebuke struck the crowd like a physical blow. Franklin, stunned by her defiance, momentarily loosened his grip. In that instant she pulled her arm free. The sheer force of her dignity did what no amount of shouting could have. It shamed him. It exposed his cruelty for what it was, the pathetic blustering of a small, empty man. Just then Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence immense. He didn't raise a hand to Franklin. He didn't need to. He simply moved between him and Lynn, a human shield of unwavering resolve. His eyes swept over the silent, watching crowd, and then he looked down at Lynn, his expression softening with a fierce, protective pride. He made his decision in that heartbeat, understanding that a half measure would no longer suffice. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "She is not my housekeeper," he announced, his gaze daring anyone to challenge him. He reached down and took Lynn's hand, his fingers closing around hers in a gesture of profound commitment. "She is to be my wife, and from this moment on, you will not address her. You will not look at her. You will not speak her name again." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a checkmate, a marriage proposal delivered as a threat. Franklin Reed stood there, his mouth agape, utterly defeated. He had meant to destroy her, but instead he had forged her a champion and handed her a crown. The ride back to the ranch was steeped in a thick, vibrating silence. Lynn sat beside Nathaniel on the wagon bench, acutely aware of his hand, which had not let go of hers since his stunning declaration in the street. His touch was not possessive, but grounding, a silent affirmation of the promise he had made. The world had irrevocably shifted. The pretense of housekeeper and employer had been burned away in the public square, replaced by something far more complex and binding. When they arrived at the homestead, the setting sun was painting the sky in strokes of fiery rose and deep violet. The beauty of it felt poignant, a quiet benediction on a day of turmoil. Samuel met them at the barn, his face etched with concern. "Word travels fast, boss. Heard what happened in town." Nathaniel simply nodded, his expression grim. "It's done." He helped Lynn down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. He finally released her hand as they walked onto the porch. The air between them was charged with unspoken questions. Inside the house, the familiar quiet felt different, heavier. Nathaniel lit a lamp, casting a warm, flickering glow across the main room. "I apologize," he said, breaking the silence. "I had no right to say that without asking you. I put you in an impossible position." Lynn turned to face him. In the lamplight she could see the strain around his eyes, the deep conflict within him. He was a man who valued his privacy above all else, and he had just announced his life to the entire town. "You protected me," she said softly. "You gave me a shield when I had none." "It's a shield that will trap you," he countered, his voice rough with emotion. "Reed will not dare to touch you now. The town will have to accept you as Mrs. Blackwood. But it is a life you did not choose." He looked away from her, towards the dark window reflecting their tense tableau. "We don't have to go through with it. I can say it was a heat-of-the-moment lie. I can arrange for you to travel to a bigger city, give you enough money to start a new life." It was a generous offer, a path to freedom. But as Lynn considered it, she felt a surprising and profound sense of loss. The thought of leaving this quiet house, this complicated, honorable man, left a hollow ache in her chest. She had been adrift, and he had been her anchor. Here, in this isolated valley, she had begun to put down roots. "And what of you?" she asked. "The town will call you a liar. Mr. Reed will say he was right about you all along." Nathaniel shrugged, the movement heavy with weariness. "I have never cared for the town's opinion." "But I do," Lynn said, surprising them both. "I care for yours." She took a hesitant step closer. "Is your offer, is it only for protection? Or is it real?" The question hung in the air, vulnerable and direct. Nathaniel turned back to her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw no fear, no calculation, only a genuine and courageous honesty. He thought of his solitary life, the years spent building a prosperous ranch that had also become a fortress around his heart. He had been content in his isolation, or so he had told himself. But this woman, with her quiet strength and unwavering dignity, had breached his defenses without even trying. She had brought a gentle light into his shadowed world. He had given her shelter, and she, in turn, was offering him a chance at a home. "It is as real as you want it to be," he answered, his voice low and sincere. The wedding was as quiet and unpretentious as the man who had proposed it. The circuit judge, a weary man who had seen every kind of frontier union, performed the ceremony in the main room of the ranch house. Samuel and his wife Clara stood as witnesses. Lynn did not wear her red cheongsam. Instead, she chose the simple calico dress, a testament to her new life. but she had woven a few wildflowers into her dark hair, a small, hopeful nod to the occasion. That night, an awkward and palpable tension settled over the house. They were husband and wife, two strangers bound together by a public declaration and a shared sense of justice. They ate the simple dinner Clara had prepared in near silence, the air thick with everything they hadn't said. After, Nathaniel built a small fire in the stone hearth, the flames pushing back the encroaching shadows. "I have prepared the guest room for myself," he said, his back to her. "You should not feel obligated. This was my doing." Lynn watched the firelight dance across his strong shoulders. This man had offered her his name, his home, his protection. He was now offering her distance, a final measure of respect for her autonomy. And in that moment, she knew she did not want it. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice steady. He turned to face her. "I never told you why I left my home," she began, choosing her words with care. "My family, they are good people, but our village is poor. They believed the letters from Mr. Reed. They believed America was a golden mountain. They sent me here with all their hopes. When he turned me away, he did not just shame me. He shamed my family. He broke their dream." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "You did not just save me from the street. You saved my family's honor. You gave their dream a new life. A marriage of protection is more than I ever could have hoped for after what happened." Nathaniel crossed the room and stood before her. He saw the depth of her gratitude, but also the loneliness she still carried. "It does not have to be just a marriage of protection, Lynn," he said gently. He confessed his own story then, of a family destroyed by a charismatic swindler years ago, a man much like Franklin Reed. It was an old wound that had taught him to despise injustice and to retreat from the world of men. "When I saw Reed do that to you," he admitted, his voice thick with memory, "I saw the same cruelty that ruined my father. I couldn't stand by. I didn't plan for any of this, but I do not regret it." He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating before gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate tenderness. The simple gesture sent a shock of warmth through her. "I would be honored to be your husband, Lynn. In truth, if you will have me." She looked up into his steady gray eyes and saw not a stranger, but a partner. A man whose quiet strength mirrored her own. A man whose wounds resonated with hers. She raised her hand and placed it over his, her touch a silent answer. "I will have you, Nathaniel," she whispered. The pact, forged in defiance, was finally sealed in a quiet promise, not of convenience, but of a shared and hopeful future. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm and steady heartbeat in their new home. Months passed, and the harsh heat of summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The rhythms of the ranch became the rhythms of their life. Lynn rose with the dawn, the scent of coffee and wood smoke filling the house. She learned the names of the constellations in the vast, clear night sky from Nathaniel. He, in turn, learned the quiet language of her presence, the way she would hum softly while tending her now flourishing garden, the small, contented sigh she gave when they sat together on the porch after a long day. Their marriage, born of crisis, grew into a partnership of deep and abiding respect. He admired her resilience, the quiet grace with which she navigated her new world. She admired his integrity, the unshakable moral compass that guided his every action. The town of Redemption Creek, having recovered from the shock of their union, settled into a grudging acceptance. Franklin Reed had left town shortly after the wedding, unable to bear the daily reminder of his public humiliation. Martha, the store owner, became a regular visitor, bringing gossip and goods, her sharp eyes softening with genuine approval whenever she saw Lynn. She was no longer the rejected bride. She was Mrs. Blackwood, mistress of the valley's largest ranch, a figure of quiet strength. The soft romance that had sparked between them grew steadily, nurtured by small, everyday moments. It was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he'd found while riding the fence line, or the way she would save him the last piece of the apple pie she had learned to bake. It was in the shared glances across the dinner table, the comfortable silences on the porch, the slow, dawning realization that the space between them was no longer filled with awkwardness, but with a warm and vital affection. One cool evening, as a harvest moon hung low and luminous in the sky, they stood by the corral, watching the horses settle for the night. "Do you ever miss it?" Nathaniel asked, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. "The sea? Your home?" Lynn thought for a moment, the scent of hay and dry earth filling her senses. She remembered the vibrant chaos of her village, the salty tang of the ocean air, but it felt like a story from another life, a different person. "I miss my parents," she said honestly, "but this is my home now." She looked around at the sprawling ranch, the solid house with its welcoming lamplight, the vast protective sky above. She looked at the man standing beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as the mountains on the horizon. Nathaniel reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. He had offered her a world when hers had been snatched away, but she had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, a reason for his fortress to become a home. He had saved her from being left in the dust, and she had saved him from a life of profound solitude. Together, under the watchful moon, they had found their own kind of redemption.